All right. Well, I think we'll still have a few people trickling in the next couple of minutes, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Asia, for joining us. Really excited to have you as our final speaker of the fall semester. So Dr. Asia Murphy is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Arizona. She examined urban ecology with a focus on native pollinator communities through an interdisciplinary lens. She obtained her doctorate in ecology from Penn State University. And when she's not exploring interspecific interactions in our changing world, which will be the subject of our talk, she's taking pictures of native bees. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Give me a minute. That should work there. And let's see, start. All right, so again, I'm going to be talking about interspecific interactions in a changing world, mostly focusing on how humans and our influence on the environment influences these interactions. First, I'd like to acknowledge all of the people and the organizations that help to fund the research that I'm talking about, along with collaborators, colleagues, undergraduates, and field assistants. And I'd also like to mention that I am currently on unceded Udham and Hohokam land here in Tucson, Arizona. So if you're ever interested in what indigenous lands you are on, you can always look it up on nativeland.ca. So we all know interspecific interactions. They can usually be separated into two categories. One's positive interactions, ones that influence and help both species that are interacting. So for example, here I have a native bee species. I believe it's the bicolored striped sweat bee. And we can see that this pollen from this rose is connected to these bees. So they get a place to sleep. And once they're gone, the pollen gets transferred to other flowers. We also have negative interactions. So this is a lizard. Actually, it's a water skink that I saw in Madagascar while I was doing field research. It's eating a crab. Obviously, predation is a negative interaction for at least one of those species. Another interaction that we can see right here is a porcupine, and then after a minute or so, you can see a bobcat trailing after that porcupine. Bobcats can kill porcupines, even though it's a little hard for them. But as I mentioned, humans are also a part of these interactions. So this is from the Predator universe, which is a science fiction kind of horror franchise that I really like. And in this case, we have apex predators, which are the original Predator that you saw in the 1982 movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, the one where he says, "Get to the chopper," really funny. And then you have humans, which are the super predator, the one that the normal predator actually tries to avoid because it can kill them. So we're basically above apex predators, mesopredators, smaller predators, prey, etc. And because we are part of these interactions, and because we do cause fear in different species, we can also influence these interactions. Another way that we can influence interactions is by creating or changing ecosystems. We usually do this by causing habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, but we can also create new ecosystems, such as what you see with regreening projects, transferring brown fields into greenways and wildflower meadows. In this case, we can create ecosystems to help species. So I'm going to be talking about 3 different projects that I've worked on in the past decade. The first one is going to be my master's research in Madagascar. The second will be my PhD research in Pennsylvania. And then the third is going to be my first postdocs research in North America. I was focused on North America, but I was at UC Santa Cruz when I did it. So Madagascar is the 8th continent. it's called the eighth continent because it has a lot of biodiversity, a lot of endemism. About 100% of the mammals that can't fly are endemic to there, so they can be found nowhere else in the world. And as I mentioned, it is a biodiversity hotspot. So we have the ring-tailed Von Sierra right here on the left, and then from left to right, we have the helmeted vonga, which is an endemic bird, and we have the lowland striped tenrec, which is also an endemic mammal. But humans can bring in invasive species like domestic dogs, feral cats, and in this case, a small Indian civet. And island ecosystems are very sensitive to invasion by other species. Dogs have caused 11 extinctions across the globe that we know of, and cats have also caused a number of extinctions across island ecosystems. And in this case, we might think that these three non-native predators could also interact negatively with native predators like the ring-tailed Von Sierra or the fossa, which is the largest terrestrial carnivore in Madagascar. But another way that they can interact with both native predators and prey is by exploiting that resource, that prey resource, killing them and making it so that native predators cannot have that resource. So in this case, we have a picture of a feral cat and what we believe is a red forest rat, which is a native mammal. One way that animals can avoid being killed by predators is by avoiding being in the same area as those predators. So what I wanted to do for my master's research, one of the questions I asked was, do native prey species spatially avoid invasive predators like dogs and cats and small Indian civets? And I looked across two guilds, small mammals, first of all. So right here in the top middle, we have the white-tailed tufted tailed forest rat. And then on the bottom, we have the common tenrec, which is a large tenrec, again, small mammal. And then the birds are the red-breasted kua, which is on the left, and the Madagascar crested ibis, which is on the right, one of the largest birds that I focused on. And to get at this question of whether native prey species would avoid these exotic predators, I used camera traps. I use camera traps in basically all my research. So if you do not know how camera traps work, it's pretty simple. You have a red fox, it walks in front of the camera, the beam is triggered and the camera takes a picture. On this picture, we have information such as time, temperature. If you know where the camera is placed, which you should, because otherwise you're not going to be able to get it back. If you know where the camera is placed, you have the GPS location. So you have geographic location. You can get information about habitat that's around that camera. You can get a lot of interesting data from just a picture. But a lot of the times you have animals that will not walk in front of the camera and you will not get their picture. So what do you do in those situations? Well, you use something called occupancy modeling. I'm not sure how many people are, familiar with occupancy modeling, so I'll just go through it really briefly. We have the purple circles on the left, and those are our camera locations, 4 of them, so places where we put our cameras. At 2 of these locations, we took a picture of a fox, so we know that foxes are there, foxes were detected. And then at 1 of these locations, a fox was not detected, so maybe it walked around the camera or whatever, maybe the camera was malfunctioning. But because we're omnipresent and we know everything, we know that the foxes are still there. So by estimating the locations, estimating the probability of actually detecting a red fox using camera traps, we can figure out what occurrence probability is, which is the probability that a location that we surveyed is actually occupied by the species of interest. So in this case, what I did was I used all the camera locations that we had across the Mswala Makira protected area complex, just like 7 sites, at least 100 camera locations, probably more. And in this example, we have the dog, which is in blue. And at these 3 different locations, which are in blue, we have dogs which were detected. And only dogs were detected at these locations. In the red, we have these 2 locations where only Madagascar crested ibises were detected. And then in the purplish color, we have locations where both species were detected. And using that information, we can use 2 species occupancy models to figure out co-occurrence patterns between domestic dogs and Madagascar crested ibises. So what is the difference between a Madagascar crested ibis's occupancy probability at a location where dogs are not present and at locations where dogs are present? So in this case, we have our 3 non-native predators, dogs, small Indian civets, feral cats, and our, I believe it's 9 different prey species. And what we found was that it was mostly small mammals that were influenced by the presence of a non-native predator. So dogs influence the occupancy probability of 2 different small mammals. Small Indian civets influence the probability of 2 species. One was a small mammal, one was a Madagascar wood rail, a bird. And then feral cats also influence the probability of occurrence for a small mammal. So in this case, the red forest rat is already threatened by habitat loss, but it also avoids dogs and small Indian civets, either because of predation or for some other reason. We're not sure because we usually don't get that kind of information on camera, unfortunately. But you have this trend of red forest rats increasingly avoiding dogs in really patchy habitat. And you have to wonder, where is this forest rat going to go if the habitat gets smaller and smaller and smaller? There might reach a point where red forest rats are going to have to be extirpated from this habitat patch, which can decrease their population, obviously, their global population. Moving on from Masal and Makira, we're going to go to Pennsylvania, where I also looked at predator-prey interactions. So in Pennsylvania, my research was largely focused on looking at coyotes and how they influence the spatial and temporal co-occurrence between black bears, bobcats, and then white-tailed deer fawns, because white-tailed deers, hunting white-tailed deer is a very, very influential economy, influential activity that brings in a lot of tax money for Pennsylvania, about $10 million in 2021. And predation, both direct and indirect. So a coyote killing a fawn, obviously lowers its survival, but a coyote even being present in the area can cause stress in a fawn, which might end up causing it to die, which causes, again, lower survival. So I wanted to see what fawns actually do, what strategies do they use to avoid these different predators, black bears, bobcats, and coyotes. And again, we go back to this idea of fawns avoiding being in the same area as a predator, a black bear or a bobcat or a coyote. But you can also avoid predators on a time axis. So if you can avoid being active at the same time as a predator, you can hopefully avoid being killed by that predator. And you can also have this kind of check jump strategy where you avoid being in the same area at the same time as a predator. So the last strategy that I looked at was vigilance. And in this case, I'm going to show you guys a clip from Aliens 1986. Again, another sci-fi horror franchise.
I got signals, I got readings in front and behind.
Where, man? I don't. He's right, there's nothing back here.
Look, I'm telling you, there's something moving and it ain't us.
Tracker's off scale, man. They're all around us, man. Jesus.
Maybe they don't show up on infrared at all.
So if that lady had been a little bit more vigilant, a little bit sharper eyed, she might have caught the fact that there is a xenomorph right behind her, and she wouldn't have been killed, which you see in the next scene. But we're focusing on white-tailed deer fawns. So what I looked at was spatial co-occurrence between white-tailed deer fawns and the 3 predators. I also looked at temporal co-occurrence. So when are fawns active, and how does the presence or the absence of one of these predators influence that? And then I also looked at vigilance using pictures, kind of scoring body language. On the right, you see the fawn, heads up, ears out, it's listening, it looks vigilant. The one that's looking down at the ferns, it doesn't look too vigilant, so that would be scored as a 0. The fawn that is vigilant would be scored as a 1. I use generalized additive mixed models to look into that. And basically what we found was that at our sites that was a little bit less disturbed, it was surrounded by a private forest. So the state forest was surrounded by private forest. It was more of an undisturbed habitat. We saw a high spatial overlap between fawns and their predators. We saw a moderate temporal overlap between them. So sometimes they were active at the same times, sometimes they weren't. We saw 4 instances of spatio-temporal avoidance, so avoiding being in the same area at the same time as that predator. And we also saw vigilance increase with predator relative abundance, as opposed to our more disturbed sites that were surrounded by agriculture and urbanization. We saw high spatial and high temporal overlap between the predators and fawns. We saw 2 instances of spatial temporal avoidance. So in one case, fawns avoided being in the same area as a coyote for a period of about 12 to 24 hours, if I remember correctly. And interestingly, there was no influence of predator relative abundance on vigilance. So there's a shift somewhere in between these study sites that I kind of want to believe that is due to anthropogenic disturbance, where fawns are being pushed into this spatial temporal room, this cube, and it's being pushed and squeezed into an even smaller cube of space and time with the predators. And instead of being more vigilant, it's being less vigilant. One thing we did see that was interesting for fawn vigilance was that deer vigilance actually increased during the day, which actually mapped out really nicely with when humans were out in the state forest, as opposed to at night. Their vigilance decreased as soon as it was like 6 p.m. It didn't increase again until it was like 6 a.m. Again, this could be because of differences in body language during day or night, but I did score on the fact that their ears were up and out, listening. Even though they might not be able to see a predator at night, they should be able to listen and hear for a predator. So it's interesting to see this difference in between deer vigilance, where when humans are active and when humans are not active. And the last project I'm going to be talking about is this camera trap conglomeration that I did for to look at the interactions between North American carnivore competitors. So this graph from Bauder et al. 2022 shows that coyote harvest is kind of going up as the years go past, and then red fox and gray fox harvest is going down. Again, it's not a causation. We don't know if it's caused by coyotes being present, but we do know that coyotes do kill red foxes and gray foxes. And it's possible that as more coyotes appear in this region, you have red fox and gray fox populations going down. So I wanted to look at that and the fact that coyotes are thought to be this new apex predator, especially in the eastern ecological forests and ecosystems, because they just recently colonized the East Coast, and there aren't any other large apex predators out there except for black bears, which are more omnivorous. So I was looking at how coyotes and other predators are influenced by the disturbance and by humans and by apex predators and how those interactions change. I focused on, I think it was 6 smaller carnivores: bobcats, raccoons, gray foxes, red foxes, opossums, and striped skunks, and how coyotes were interacting with these different species across North America, and how those interactions were influenced by disturbance and apex predators. So in this case, we have predator and prey. So you'd have coyote as the predator, and you'd have gray fox as potential prey. Apex predator in this case could either be a puma or it could be a human. And in this case, you would expect a coyote or a xenomorph to avoid that super predator, that apex predator that can kill them. And you might end up having a case where the prey of the predator is searching for refuge in the shadow, the spatiotemporal shadow of the apex predator. And that's what happened in Alien versus Predator, which came out in like 2002, I believe, where Santa Lathan actually survived being in this pyramid in the Antarctic because she ended up making an alliance with the predator who protected her, helped protect her from xenomorphs, which would have killed her. Another case where anthropogenic disturbance can actually influence these spatial interactions is habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. As you make these patches of habitat smaller and smaller, you're forcing these different prey, different species to interact within a smaller spatial space. So that's another way that anthropogenic disturbance can actually influence these interactions. And that's what I wanted to look at as well. So using these 2 species spatial co-occurrence models, I found that coyote spatial interactions with these smaller mesopredators was actually either neutral or positive. So coyotes either didn't influence the occurrence probability of these different species, or the presence of coyotes actually made different species like opossums, their occupancy probability was actually higher at these locations where coyotes were present. So you can see an example here of detection probability, which is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is human relative abundance, a beta estimate of that. And you can see that at these locations where coyotes are alone and where red foxes are alone, so there's no either red foxes for coyotes or there's no coyotes for red foxes. You can see that their relationship to human relative abundance is basically not really a relationship. But once you switch over to the right graph, you can see that coyote detection probability when red foxes are present kind of takes on this negative relationship with human relative abundance. And red fox detection actually kind of takes on a really strong negative relationship with human relative abundance, to the point where you stop detecting red foxes at this estimate of human relative abundance, beta estimate around 10, whereas in locations where there are no coyotes, red foxes are still detected at low numbers or at a low rate, but still detected. So it's interesting to see that just the simple addition of a coyote at this location can so strongly change red fox detection's relationship to human relative abundance. And for raccoons, we see kind of the same thing. So we have coyotes in the purple and human relative abundance, again, on x-axis, occupancy probability this time, on the y-axis, so the probability that a location is occupied by a coyote or a raccoon. And we see this negative relationship with human relative abundance for both species. But raccoon occupancy and its relationship with human relative abundance actually kind of becomes, the line actually becomes a little steeper when coyotes are present, to the point where raccoons, we stop having raccoons supposedly occupy this location when coyotes are also present, way faster than when they're at a location by themselves and it's just humans that they have to contend with. So in this case, you might wonder if just the addition of a coyote to a location might cause raccoon extirpation from that location a little bit faster than usual. For temporal overlap, we saw that these two species, opossums and bobcats, they're sort of the maximum and minimum overlap that we saw. So we have 62% overlap with opossums and coyotes, and 90% overlap with bobcats and coyotes. And then we have the other 4 mesopredators kind of at the same, kind of circling around opossums, even though red foxes actually has 78% temporal overlap with coyotes. We saw the activity patterns and when these different species were active during the day and night actually change with coyote relative abundance. So I split coyote relative abundance into 3 categories. None, obviously. Less, which was like, I think, less than or equal to 2.6 pictures or detections of coyotes a day, and to more. So that was the higher estimate. And once you get into these different categories, you see activity patterns for bobcats, gray foxes, red foxes, raccoons, and striped skunks actually shift and change significantly. And the presence of apex predators can actually also influence the temporal overlap between coyotes and these smaller mesopredators. So when we saw an apex predator present at a location, bobcat, gray fox, raccoon, red fox, temporal overlap was actually less at these locations where apex predators and coyotes were present than where only coyotes were present. So you see this kind of facilitation of an apex predator's presence, this facilitation of a temporal niche partitioning between coyotes and these smaller predators. And just to focus on one species, we see in this graph, you have I'm not sure what the axes are labeled because I know that there's a Z in there somewhere, but we have spatial temporal value, which is just the spatial interaction factor multiplied by the temporal overlap. We have the hour of day, so 8 a.m., 12 p.m., 4 p.m., etc. And then we have urbanization, the beta estimate of urbanization. So as you go up this axis, it becomes more urbanized. And you see that there's this high spatial temporal overlap between bobcats and coyotes. So it never goes below 1, which means that they're attracted to each other. And it actually increases as urbanization increases. But at the same time, it seems that bobcats are using this spatial temporal avoidance to coexist with coyotes. So I used this randomization code to figure out the detections, expected detections of bobcats after a coyote detection within a 1-hour period, a 4-hour period, a 12-hour period, 1 day, and 2 days. And then I compared them to the actual percentage of detections that we found. So observed versus the simulated detections. And you can see that observed percentages is 0 for all of these different time periods. So we didn't see any bobcats 2 days within a coyote detection, even though in expected fashion, you would expect to see at least 1% of coyote detections within that time period of a coyote being present. So you can see that just because they're using the same locations and because they're active largely at the same time, they're still trying to avoid coyotes using that sort of checker jump strategy. And in the same way, again, expected versus simulated, we saw that not only bobcats, but gray foxes, red foxes, and striped skunks were less likely to be detected within 2 days of a coyote detection at a location. So another thing that we saw was that while apex predators influenced one spatial relationship between coyotes and mesopredators and decreased the temporal overlap between coyotes and bobcats, the foxes, and I believe it was the raccoon, if I remember that slide correctly. Urbanization, human relative abundance, the relative abundance of vehicles, etc. Those influence six spatial and spatial temporal relationships between coyotes and these mesopredators, and actually increased temporal overlap or spatial overlap 4 times within all of the little things that we were looking at, which kind of gives to mind that at least in this case, humans, their activity and their footprint actually influenced the partitioning between coyotes and these smaller mesopredators a lot more than apex predators. So just as a takeaway from this talk, I'm not sure. I forgot to turn on my stopwatch, but it looks like it's 11:33 my time. So just as a takeaway from this talk, what I found throughout my research career is that taking into account more than space or time or behavior is really important. You kind of have to take into account all of that stuff to look at species interactions. So in the case of my Madagascar research, I only looked at spatial co-occurrence between the small mammals, the birds, and dogs, cats, and small Indian civets. But it might have been interesting, it might have shown a better picture if I had also looked at temporal activity of these native prey species and the non-native predators. If I had been able to figure out how to look at vigilance using these pictures, it would have been very useful to look at that as well. Another thing that I found was that short-term behaviors, so behaviors that you can only see at like a 2-day scale, a 1-day scale, etc., are probably more prevalent than just a basic static, a coyote is over here, so I never use that habitat. I always just use this habitat, or I'm always active at night because coyotes are always active during the day. These short-term behaviors, these spatial temporal relationships are probably more prevalent and more important in the interactions between these species, especially in urban areas and cities where there's less space and there's also less time for animals to be active. And I say less time because there's been a lot of research on how wildlife will change their activity patterns to avoid being active at the same time as humans. And this, again, kind of cuts off their available time, at least by half. So again, they're being squeezed into this ever smaller spatial temporal cube. And within that, they have to work around their competitors and their predators. And the last point is that usually throughout my research, I found that humans actually impede niche partitioning. So they either force, so in urban areas, again, you see smaller habitat patches. And in those areas, you actually see bobcats and coyotes being more attracted to each other spatially. So they're impeding spatial niche partitioning because they're cutting off, because we're active like most of the day. Animals are trying to be active at night instead, and that makes temporal niche partitioning very hard. So as opposed to apex predators, which actually facilitated temporal partitioning, at least in the case for coyotes and these other mesopredators, humans are actually forcing species together and making it harder for them to partition their space and time. And with that, I'll take questions. I talk too fast.
You're fine. I think we all tend to. Well, thanks again, Dr. Murphy, for a wonderful talk. You are now making me want to go binge watch this weekend all the Alien and Predator films. I haven't seen them in a long time.
Yeah.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you want to be brave, you can unmute yourself, share your video, and ask them face to face. But it's like we already have one in the chat from Kylie. You can see that.
So in my opinion, what are some of the most important implications of my research for conservation management and decision making? So I think one thing in this case, it would probably, so for decision making, if you're creating a green space or a park, if you can make it as big as possible, especially if you're trying to make it a wildlife habitat and not just like a place where people can go running or walking or whatever, make it as big as possible so that it provides enough space for these different species to coexist. Another thing that I can bring up is the idea of, I'm not sure how to say this because I'm not really into decision making, but limiting the amount of time that people in cities or urban areas can use these green spaces, or even for like state forests and stuff, limiting visiting hours, basically. I'm not sure how that would go across. Pretty sure people will be mad about that, but that would provide more time, temporal space for these different species to coexist without negatively influencing either their health or their numbers.
I don't know if there'd be a good way to do it with the camera data, or maybe there's other covariates you could incorporate. But have you thought of like different types of human behaviors or use in terms of like different recreation patterns, whether they're hunting versus jogging through some of these different areas, how that might, if that might have any different impacts on sort of spatiotemporal use by these other species?
Yeah. So for my postdoc research, looking at the across North America, I separated human activity into humans. So basically people who are hiking, jogging, using non-motorized bikes and vehicles, which were the motorized stuff. So trucks, ATVs, motorized bikes, etc. Still saw like humans impeding niche partitioning between coyotes and the other mesopredators, no matter if it was just people who were doing non-motorized stuff, or they were doing motorized stuff. But yeah, obviously different activities are going to have different effects on species. Someone who's just bird watching is probably not going to have as strong an impression on animals as someone who's riding their ATV. I think there's I saw recently that someone was using those camera traps that have sound connected to them to look at how the sound of ATVs actually influences, I think it was brown bears.
cool.
I saw on Twitter, so I kind of lost it. But there's a lot of papers about it out there, I
Yeah,
think.
you'll have to look
Yeah.
into that. Interesting. And did you measure human relative abundance? I'm assuming the same as like other relative abundance, just like photo capture rate, sort of. Cool.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I always think about the activity because a lot of our work is, or the work I do is based in Yellowstone, and I live just outside the north entrance, and we have elk and deer that are just constantly moving through and using uh, all the urban areas and are completely fine moving around and navigating vehicles and people, and the same inside the national park. But then if you go into any of the Forest Service land, their behavior is completely different because now it's shifting into, okay, now there's hunters out here.
Yeah.
And humans become more of an active predator.
Well,
Super cool.
That's cool. That's interesting. Never thought of that. Like a gradient almost. Are there any other questions?
Last Friday of the semester before holidays.
Yeah.
I think everyone's probably a little
Understood.
brain fried. But I'm starting some work, or actively doing a lot of similar work with a camera trap grid geared towards estimating cougar abundance in the park. And we've got about 67 cameras distributed. And we're sort of trying to use that to also look at like mesopredator spatiotemporal overlap and how that varies with cougar, wolf, photo capture rates, all sorts of other variables. So this was a really great talk because it got me like sort of thinking about different creative ways of tackling that, because we basically have all of our occupancy models are just like ones across the board. There's really high diversity and abundance and occupancy of all of these species. So there's like no variation there. So we're trying to think of really creative ways to get at that more fine scale stuff that you're doing a lot on the temporal, spatiotemporal sort of side.
I
time
think
to
my
event
code,
stuff. So
I'm not sure
cool.
if I think, so the code that I used to simulate stuff is available. It should be. If it's not, I could just send it to you. Are you using spatial marker site models to look at cougar abundance?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's still really preliminary, but yeah, we're doing seeker models for the cougars to compare it with non-invasive genetic sampling that we were doing from 2014 to 2017 roughly. And so far it seems like we're getting roughly the same estimates from the camera grid as from the genetic surveys. Yeah, it's pretty reassuring.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm definitely going to be sharing this talk with all of my collaborators on that, because we're trying to come up with some creative ideas to try and capture how they're navigating, and it seems to all be happening on that sort of multifaceted spatial and temporal component of when they're coming through and passing through areas.
Yeah.
But yeah, great talk.
Well, thank you. There's another question. Similar patterns of spatial and temporal niche partitioning of predators been observed in other systems surrounding urban areas. So I think someone, I want to say Gallo, but I'm not sure if that's right. I think a few people have found that white-tailed deer and coyotes, they're either showing that attraction, or white-tailed deer are just not avoiding coyotes, especially in Chicago. And then there's a couple of other papers that have also been looking at that effect. I think it's usually focused on just one or two cities, so it's not as big as my study, but they are out there. And yeah, it's usually they're seeing that in urban areas, the interactions that we expect to see are not there, or just the species are just attracted to each other, so using the same areas.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, thanks again, Asia, for joining us. Have a great holidays, and same with everyone else. Thanks for
Thanks for
sticking with
inviting,
us all semester.
and thanks for listening to me.
Yeah,
I
thanks.
appreciate it. Have a good day, everyone.